Hello and welcome to VVork. I'm Brian Watrous and this is part 54 in a 10-part video series in which we're learning how to automate using vRealize Orchestrator. As you can see from the title of this particular video, what we're going to be talking about in this video and the next three is how to determine what type of variable to use in your Orchestrator workflows. Now, if you're not already familiar with the concepts of input parameters, output parameters, attributes, and parameter binding, I suggest that you first go back to parts 5 through 8 of this video series and then come back here. For the rest of us, if you're familiar with those concepts, you might be like a recent student of mine who informed me that he understood the concepts of input parameters, output parameters, and attributes, and parameter binding too, but he was still struggling when it came time to create Orchestrator workflows. He was struggling because he was having difficulty figuring out whether a variable should be an input parameter, output parameter, or an attribute. So I heard him say that and I thought to myself, how can I explain this in a different way? Well, one way I explain things differently is instead of explaining things with words, I try to explain it in a more visual manner. So that's what I've done here. As you'll see in the next videos, I've created a collection of flowcharts that I'm going to use to illustrate my thought process that I go through when creating variables. And that will show you, the flowcharts will show you how I make the determination of whether something should be an input parameter, output parameter, or an attribute. So let's jump in and see what's going on here. As you can see on this slide here, I'm making a stink about the word types. The reason why I'm making a stink about the word type is because it's overloaded with meaning. And depending upon who you're talking to and what context we're in, they could mean different things in Orchestrator when they use the word type. Oftentimes when we use the word type, we're talking about variable type. So that's the distinction between an input parameter, output parameter, and attribute. Those three things together are collectively known as variable types. On the other hand, in other situations when people are talking about types, they're not talking about variable types. Instead, they're talking about something called data types. So what's the deal here? What's the relationship between these? Well, when I create a variable, I can choose any of the three types that you see on the left. I can choose to create an input parameter, output parameter, or an attribute. Doesn't matter which. But any of those three types of variables can be assigned a different data type. So for instance, just randomly picking here, I could create an attribute that is of type string. That would allow that attribute variable to store a string of characters. On the other hand, I could have just as easily created an input parameter or an output parameter that is of type data type string. So any of the three variable types on the left can be any of the data types over on the right. So other data types include exciting things like number and Boolean. Actually, those aren't terribly exciting. Those are simple data types. But we have all sorts of more complex data types that are described by objects, such as VC virtual machine, AD computer, SSH host, properties, and so on and so on and so on. Now, to be abundantly clear here, in this video and the next two videos, I'm not talking about data types. We're going to be talking about variable types. If you're interested in data types, I recommend that you go take a look at parts 33 through 35 of this video series, where I discuss something called the API Explorer. The API Explorer allows you to explore all these different data types. So if you're interested in data types, go to parts 33 through 35. On the other hand, if you do want to know about variable types and how to determine which type of variable something should be in your workflow, let's carry on. In this video and the next two, I'm going to be using the older legacy Java-based vRO client. And the reason why I'm doing that is it tends to be easier to explain the following concepts using that older client. But many of you may already be using the new HTML5-based vRO client. The concepts I'm going to be describing in these three videos are equally applicable whether using the older Java-based client or the newer HTML5-based client, but there are a few little differences that you need to know about, starting with the fact that what the Java client calls attributes are not called attributes in the HTML5 client. Instead, the HTML5-based vRO client refers to attributes as variables. Now, I'm going to use the older terminology, attributes, instead of the term variables, because I don't want you to be confused. When I say variables, I don't want you to be confused with meaning specifically attributes. Instead, I want the term, as I described in the previous slide, I want the term variables and variable types to mean input parameters, output parameters, and attributes. So I'm going to stick with the older terminology of attributes. By the way, down in the comments below, if you have a few moments, I'd be curious to hear from you guys whether you like the switch of terminology in the HTML5 client from attributes to variables. So do you like it? Do you not like it? Let me know down below. All right, carrying on. The Java client versus the HTML5 client, they have different UIs. If you haven't already noticed this, in the Java client, the place you go to create attributes is the General tab. But if you go to the HTML5 vRO client, there is no General tab. Instead, the place you go there is called the Variables tab. Again, what the HTML5 vRO client calls variables are what I'm going to call attributes. As you continue to look down these two bullet lists, you'll notice that the Inputs tab and the Outputs tab of the Java client are represented in a single tab called the Inputs Outputs tab in the new HTML5 client. And what used to be called the Presentation tab in the Java client is now known as the Import Form tab in the HTML5 based vRO client. So from here on out, throughout the rest of this video and the next videos, I'm not going to be using the HTML5 client. I'm going to be using the older Java based vRO client because it makes it easier to explain the concepts that we're going to be exploring. So join me in the next video, and I'm going to show you specifically how to determine whether a variable should be an input parameter versus an attribute. And then in the video after that, I'll talk about how to determine whether something should be an output parameter or an attribute. So join me in the next video.